Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead, dim your lights, get cozy, and maybe pull your blanket a little tighter, because tonight we're going somewhere very cold, somewhere damp, echoing, and honestly, kind of miserable. We're heading inside the medieval castle dungeon, not the glamorous feasting hall upstairs, not the great chamber where lords and ladies draped themselves in fur and pretended not to notice the smell of sewage. No. We're going straight to the bottom, literally. Because tonight's question is simple, and strangely cozy in a very not cozy way. Where did prisoners actually sleep during those freezing medieval winters? You might imagine a stone cell, a single torch flickering, maybe a straw pile that looks like it was last changed when the Black Death was still making headlines. And honestly, yeah, that's about right. But there's a lot more to it. So let's drift into that world slowly. Take a breath. Picture an old castle on a hill. The year is maybe 1274. The wind outside sounds like it's chewing through the trees. And somewhere beneath that cold stone courtyard, under layers of moss mud and medieval bad decisions, sits a dark little room that smells like despair and wet socks. That's our setting tonight. The myth of the dungeon now. When people hear medieval dungeon, they think of some huge underground labyrinth full of skeletons and rusty chains. But in reality, most castles didn't even have what we'd call a proper dungeon. Dungeon actually comes from the French donjon, which meant the main tower, the keep. It wasn't originally a word for a prison at all. The creepy basement prison idea came later, around the late Middle Ages, when people started to realize that locking someone in a damp hole could be cheaper than chopping their head off. In early medieval times, they didn't really do long-term imprisonment. You were either executed, mutilated, or ransomed, all very efficient in their own twisted way. But by the 13th century, political prisoners, debtors, and unlucky knights began spending more time in these makeshift cells. And where did they put them? Usually wherever space allowed, under staircases, in storage vaults behind the kitchen, sometimes even in the castle's latrine shaft. Yes, the toilet tower. Because nothing says justice like sleeping next to the sewage chute. So already you can see, dungeon wasn't one universal design. It could be anything from a dry cellar to a dripping oubliette, which is French for a place you forget someone in. Very subtle naming. Temperature check. Medieval winters were brutal. Before we get to the actual sleeping situation, it's worth remembering just how cold those winters were. Medieval Europe went through what historians call the Little Ice Age, roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries. That means colder winters, longer freezes, and snow that liked to hang around like an unwanted guest. Castles themselves were cold even for the nobility. Thick stone walls kept heat out, just as effectively as they kept enemies out. The upper floors could afford fireplaces, furs, and feather beds. Down below, you had stone, moisture, and a kind of cold that got inside your bones and rented space there permanently. So, for a prisoner in winter, especially in England, France, or the German states, the question of where to sleep was basically a question of how not to freeze to death. The standard setup: straw, chains, and regret. All right, so picture a small, square room, maybe 6 feet by 8. The walls are rough, the ceiling is low, and there's a tiny slit for light that doubles as an ice dispenser when the wind blows through. The floor? Usually packed earth or bare stone. If you were lucky, you got straw. Not clean straw. This is not the golden harvest glow kind. It's moldy, flattened, and probably already lived in by rats who pay no rent. Straw was the medieval equivalent of a mattress. It provided minimal insulation and maximum smell. It was replaced rarely, if ever, and when it got damp, which it always did, it became this sour, rotting mess that clung to everything. Some cells might have had wooden planks to sleep on, basically a shelf nailed to the wall. But that was a luxury reserved for noble prisoners, or anyone the jailer liked enough not to die in their care. Ordinary prisoners? They slept on straw, sometimes chained to the wall or the floor. Chains weren't just to stop escape. They were also a way of saying, no, you don't get to roll over comfortably. So picture lying flat on your back, your wrist or ankle attached to cold iron, your body slowly cooling against damp stone. The straw beneath you clings like wet hay, and somewhere in the corner, water drips endlessly. Drip, 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 and congratulations, you're in a medieval sleepover. What they wore or didn't. Clothing made a huge difference. Wealthier captives might have been allowed to keep their cloaks or even bring blankets. Political prisoners, like rival nobles, were sometimes given beds, food, and even servants. Take, for example, the imprisonment of King John II of France after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. He was technically a prisoner, but he lived in luxury in the Tower of London, hosting banquets and playing chess. Not exactly sleeping on straw there, but for the everyday person, a peasant, a thief, maybe a soldier who got on the wrong side of a baron, clothing was minimal. They might be stripped down to their undertunic, maybe a cloak if they were lucky. And yes, that means bare skin against damp air. Body heat was their only insulation. You'd see prisoners huddled together like penguins, partly to stay alive, partly because the human body is warmer than medieval architecture. Blankets, when given, were coarse wool or sometimes just sacks. The kind of fabric that could double as sandpaper. So when we ask where did prisoners sleep, it's not just where it's in what condition. And most of them, frozen, filthy, and half-naked. Smell factor, a medieval scent experience. Let's not skip over this part, because it adds atmosphere. Dungeons weren't ventilated. The air was thick with moisture, sweat, rot, and worse. There were no proper toilets, just buckets, if that. So yes, the floor often doubled as a bathroom. Combine that with moldy straw, unwashed bodies and rats, and you've got yourself a medieval version of a scented candle, if that candle was made of despair. It's hard to sleep when the air tastes like mildew and misery, but after a few weeks the human body just gives up. You get used to it. People adapted. Sleep came not because it was comfortable, but because the body was exhausted enough to stop caring. Prison hierarchy. Some got beds. Others got holes. Now not every prisoner had the same experience. Let's drift briefly through the medieval class system. Even in jail, hierarchy followed you like a bad smell. Nobles, usually kept in guarded chambers, sometimes even furnished ones. They might have beds, servants, and decent food. Their imprisonment was closer to house arrest, just with fewer windows and more complaining. Clergy or scholars, often given private cells, less filthy, but still cold and basic. A straw mattress, maybe a small table for writing confessions or letters to God. Commoners, the majority, thrown into communal cells, packed tight, straw everywhere, filth everywhere else. Think of it as a medieval hostel, but without snacks or hygiene. The truly unlucky locked in oubliettes, vertical shafts, sometimes only accessible by rope ladder or trap door. You couldn't even stand upright. These were meant for long-term forgetting. Some had no bedding at all, just mud. In winter, the temperature in those holes dropped close to freezing. There are accounts of prisoners surviving for weeks in such places, curled up like animals, half-conscious, shivering, and probably hallucinating. Sleep wasn't restful. It was a survival response. Light, noise, and time, the sleep killers. One fun thing about medieval prisons, they didn't care about time. There were no windows big enough to track the day. Light came from torches, smoky, dim, and short-lived. Once the jailer left, you were in darkness. Real darkness. The kind that erases sense of time. Some prisoners later described losing track of days entirely. Sleep patterns broke down. They'd doze off whenever the body forced them to, then wake up unsure if it was day or night. Noise didn't help either. Chains clinking, guards moving above, rats scurrying, sometimes screams from another cell. Sleep came in fragments, thin layers of rest interrupted by sound, cold, and discomfort. So when people romanticize medieval castles, the grand halls, the banners, the knights, it's worth remembering that just a few floors down, someone was lying in the dark, counting drips and trying to remember what the sun looked like. Food and warmth, the bare minimum. Let's talk about what went into those poor souls, because it affects how they slept. Prisoners were fed barely enough to live. Bread, water, maybe some thin soup. Malnutrition was common, and with it came weakness, constant fatigue, and poor circulation. At some point we have to stop thinking of sleep as rest and see it for what it really was, a way to survive until morning. Most prisoners didn't sleep, they collapsed. The body conserved energy by shutting down. It wasn't restorative, it was defensive. The next morning the jailer might bring bread, maybe check who was still breathing. If you made it another night, congratulations. You were still technically in the game. The richest man in the coldest cell. One famous example of a comfortable prisoner was James I of Scotland. He was captured by the English in 1406 and held for 18 years. 18. Now, he wasn't exactly rotting in a pit. He was educated, given decent rooms, and even wrote poetry while imprisoned. But he still complained constantly about the cold. He described frost forming on the inside of his windows, and how his ink would thicken overnight. So if royalty was freezing in semi-luxury, you can imagine what was happening to the regular folks down below. Sleep as survival. At some point, we have to stop thinking of sleep as rest and see it for what it really was, a way to survive until morning. Most prisoners didn't sleep, they collapsed. The body conserved energy by shutting down. It wasn't restorative, it was defensive. The next morning, the jailer might bring bread, maybe check who was still breathing. If you made it another night, congratulations, you were still technically in the game. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you've drifted off already, well, that's probably for the best, because tonight's next stretch of story is not exactly a lullaby. It's cold, damp and kind of depressing, but also strangely peaceful, in that nothing left to lose medieval way. So let's drift down again, into the chill. Last time, we wandered through the generic idea of a dungeon, the straw, the chains, the never-ending drip of water. But now we're going to meet a few of the people who actually lived, and sometimes died, in those places. People who left behind letters, poems or complaints about exactly how miserable their nights were. Because history may forget names, but it somehow never forgets bad plumbing. The Tower of London, a cold luxury. Let's start with the Tower of London, maybe the most famous castle-prison combo in all of Europe. You might imagine every prisoner there chained in some torchlit pit, but the tower was a mixed bag. Some prisoners lived fairly comfortably. Others froze like leftovers in a stone fridge. One of the earliest recorded prisoners was Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, locked up in 1100 for, you guessed it, being too good at collecting taxes. The man was literally the medieval version of a crooked accountant. Flambard's cell wasn't actually underground. He was held in a small stone chamber inside the White Tower. And while it was better than a dungeon, it was still brutally cold. He later wrote, complained about his stone pillow and airless night, describing how the chills sank through his bones even with a cloak wrapped around him. But Ranulph was clever. He eventually escaped, not through brute force, but through alcohol. He hosted a fake drinking party for his guards, got them drunk and climbed down a rope smuggled in a wine barrel. So yes, the first escape from the Tower of London was powered by bad wine and worse supervision. And somewhere in that story, you can picture him, shaking from the cold, fumbling with the rope, realizing that anything was better than another winter night on stone. The Cell of Thomas Malory, writer, Knight in Voluntary Ice Sculpture. Now, a bit later on we have Sir Thomas Malory, the man who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, the legendary book about King Arthur and his knights. Romantic tales of honor, warmth, shining armor, written by a guy literally freezing in a cell. Malory spent years imprisoned in the mid-15th century, accused of robbery, assault, and probably existing at the wrong time in history. He wrote most of Le Morte d'Arthur while in a cold stone room, possibly at Newgate Prison. And Newgate was, let's call it unsanitary. Contemporary descriptions call it a stinking hole of airless corruption, so just your average Airbnb listing for $14.60. There were no beds, just straw, often soaked in filth. Prisoners were expected to pay bribes for food, or even for a bucket to relieve themselves. Malory's writings include some subtle jabs at his own situation. He often describes knights being cast into foul prisons, where they lay sorely beset by hunger and cold, which is basically medieval for I hate it here. Imagine that, the world's most romantic tales of chivalry, written by a man sitting in the dark, shivering, wrapped in a ragged cloak, surrounded by moaning debtors and coughing thieves. If that doesn't sum up the creative process, I don't know what does. Political prisoners, comfort and hypocrisy. Let's float over to the other end of the social ladder, the political prisoners. Now these people, they got the deluxe dungeons, big rooms, fireplaces, tapestries, sometimes even servants. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen, rebel, and professional family disappointment. After she helped her sons rebel against her husband, King Henry II, she was imprisoned for 16 years. But imprisoned is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Her cell was a series of private apartments in castles across England. She had her ladies-in-waiting, access to books, and warm fires. She even went hunting occasionally. But make no mistake, she still complained. Repeatedly. Apparently. The rooms were cold and the food was bad. So yes, even medieval royalty could still sound like a Yelp review. Compare that to the nameless peasants thrown into the same castle's undercrofts, where their room service consisted of a stale loaf and a rat-staring contest. The oubliette, a place you don't come back from, and now. Let's drift a little lower, because not every cell had a door. Some were oubliettes, those infamous forgotten places. Basically, a hole in the ground, often bottle-shaped, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. Prisoners were lowered down by rope or ladder, if they were lucky. Sometimes they were just dropped. There was no light. No bedding, no fire, just stone, dirt, and your own thoughts slowly freezing with you. At Château de Loches in France, one of the most famous oubliettes still survives. Visitors describe it as eerily silent and impossible to imagine living inside. But medieval prisoners did live and die inside it. A few accounts mention prisoners who were kept there for years. They'd sleep curled against the wall, using rags or straw to create a nest. The cold wasn't just physical. It became mental. People started hearing things, losing track of days. And because the cell was so deep underground, it stayed damp year-round. In winter, water froze on the walls. Some historians estimate the temperature could drop close to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. Imagine trying to sleep in that, without fire, blanket, or hope. That's not rest, that's suspended animation. The jailer's role, the cold decider. You might assume the jailer was just a guard, but he was also the thermostat, the chef, and the general decider of whether you lived comfortably or not. A kind jailer might give prisoners straw, blankets, maybe a candle for warmth. A cruel one might forget those things, especially in winter. There's a record from 1315 of a jailer in York who pocketed money meant for prisoner blankets and instead gave them nothing. 4 prisoners froze to death that winter. When authorities found out, the jailer was fined not for the deaths, but for mismanaging royal property, because apparently the real tragedy was losing the straw budget. So yes, warmth in prison wasn't a right. It was a favor. Sleep in rotation, the shared straw pile. In crowded jails, space was limited, so prisoners didn't each get their own sleeping spot. They shared, often in shifts. One group would lie down while the others sat or stood, waiting for their turn on the straw. At London's Newgate prison in the 14th century, a visitor described men lying like cordwood, shoulder to shoulder, shivering together. Another account from France said prisoners would breathe upon one another to find rest. Human warmth became the only heat source, a grim but effective strategy. And yet, this sharing of misery created a strange camaraderie. There are stories of prisoners singing softly at night, partly to stay awake, partly to feel human again. Some even made crude games out of counting drips or guessing the hour. It's kind of tragic and oddly touching. Even in the coldest, filthiest places, people found tiny ways to keep their spirits alive. The smugglers of straw now. Here's something mildly funny, in a sad way. In certain prisons, straw became a sort of currency. If you were new, you might pay another prisoner to give up a fresh patch of straw near the wall. Guards sometimes charged for extra straw, literally selling comfort by the handful. One record from a 15th century German jail mentions a prisoner trading his bread ration for a blanket, which, to be fair, is the most medieval version of "would you rather be hungry or cold?" ever recorded. And in winter, the straw piles would slowly shrink, used as fuel, padding, or desperate attempts at insulation. By spring, the cell floors were often bare again and full of the remnants of winter survival. When coldy was the punishment. Some prisons took things a step further. Cold wasn't just a condition, it was a punishment. In some German and Scandinavian castles, there was something called a cold cell. It was a small, damp stone room deliberately built near the moat or an exterior wall. In winter, the walls would freeze from condensation, and frost would form inside. Prisoners were thrown in naked or half-dressed for short periods, an early form of chilling therapy, if you will. It didn't kill them outright, but it broke them fast. Even the strongest men begged to be returned to ordinary cells. Record from 1479 mentions a Danish prisoner who spent 2 nights in the cold room and emerged half senseless and white as wax. And somehow, the scribe wrote that as if it was totally fine. Hey again, welcome back to the chill. If you're still with me, you might want to grab a blanket, because tonight we're opening the heavy iron doors of some of Europe's most famous castles, the ones that doubled as prisons, and we're going to take a very slow, very cold walk through them. No torches needed. The stories will keep us warm enough. Well, warmish. We've already talked about how medieval prisoners tried to sleep through winter, usually on straw, sometimes on stone, occasionally on sheer stubbornness. But now we're going to peek into the actual places where all that happened. The real rooms still standing today, damp, dark, and somehow both fascinating and depressing at the same time. So, let's start with one of the coldest, and ironically, most beautiful prisons in Europe. Château de Château, Switzerland's lakeside icebox. Imagine a postcard-perfect lake in Switzerland, clear blue water, snowy mountains in the distance, swans gliding peacefully. Now put a medieval prison underneath it. That's Château de Château, on Lake Geneva. From the outside it looks like something out of a fairy tale. Turrets, arches, beautiful reflections on the water. Inside, it was one of the coldest and most famous prison sites of the Middle Ages. The lower floors, right down by the lake, were used as cells. And yes, they were basically caves carved from rock. You could hear the water sloshing against the walls, smell the algae, and feel the temperature drop the moment you entered. In winter, Lake Geneva would freeze along the edges, turning the dungeon into a kind of natural refrigerator. Moisture seeped in constantly. Prisoners described frost creeping up the stone, their straw bedding turning to mush overnight. One of the most famous captives was François Bonivard, a Genevan monk imprisoned there in the 1530s. He was chained to a column for 6 years. Yes, 6. In the damp lower hall. Bonivard later wrote about the chill that seeps into the bones until they forget their warmth. He was allowed a small lamp, some straw and a blanket that probably did about as much good as a handkerchief in a blizzard. When Lord Byron visited Chillon centuries later, he was so moved that he wrote The Prisoner of Chillon, a poem full of icy misery and quiet endurance. Romantic? Maybe realistic? Absolutely not. The actual experience was less poetic and more... My toes are falling off. Even today, when you visit the dungeons at Chillon, the air feels colder than the rest of the castle. Always. It's like the stones themselves, remember. The Tower of London, cold stones and colder politics. We touched on the tower earlier, but it's worth revisiting, because it wasn't just a prison. It was a collection of prisons, stacked like layers of misery. Every corner of the tower had a cell, and every cell had its own temperature personality. The underground vaults, like the Cradle Tower and the Salt Tower, were particularly cruel in winter. Moisture from the Thames River seeped through the walls, making them perpetually damp. The air hung heavy with the smell of mold and seawater. A few prisoners were noble enough to complain, and their letters give us vivid glimpses. Thomas Wyatt the Younger, imprisoned during Queen Mary's reign, wrote about the stone that bites the flesh in cold hours. Anne Boleyn, before her execution, described the bitter night and how she could not sleep, for the chill and for the thoughts. Even Guy Fawkes, centuries later, endured the same atmosphere, a cell so cold that his wounds reopened from shivering. The tower didn't discriminate when it came to temperature. Everyone froze equally, just at different price points. And while nobles like Sir Walter Raleigh had fireplaces and books, the lower prisoners, the ones in the so-called Cold Harbour cells, had nothing but stone. Those cells still exist, by the way. You can stand inside them today, and even in summer. You'll feel the air turn to ice around your ankles. It's the tower's way of saying yes. History lingers here, and it's still freezing. Locke's Castle, France's vertical tomb. If there were an award for most gloomy French dungeon, Château de Loches would win it easily. It sits on a cliff above the Indre River, all turrets and limestone glory, looking deceptively charming, until you go underground. The dungeons of Loches are infamous. The walls drip constantly with moisture. The air smells faintly metallic like cold iron. The worst part? The oubliettes, Those bottle-shaped pits we talked about earlier. Loches has some of the best preserved ones in France. You can still peer down into them, narrow shafts, maybe 10 feet deep, ending in total darkness. Prisoners dropped inside had no bedding. They slept sitting up or curled on bare rock. There are still faint scratch marks along the walls, whether from fingernails or tools. No one's quite sure. In winter, the cold air would sink straight into those pits. Water from the upper levels trickled down and froze. It wasn't unusual for prisoners to die of exposure before starvation. And the silence, that was the worst part. Imagine being underground, hearing nothing but your own breathing and the faint echo of dripping water. No torches, no fires, no human voices. Just a long, slow freeze into history. Castel Sant'Angelo, Rome's coldest mausoleum. Next stop, Italy. Now, when you think of Rome, you think of warmth, sunshine, maybe a little wine on a balcony. But even Rome has its cold side. The Castel Sant'Angelo, originally built as Emperor Hadrian's tomb, was later converted into a fortress and inevitably a prison, because apparently every nice building in medieval Europe eventually became a place to put people you didn't like. The lower chambers were carved into the ancient stone base, massive, echoing halls with almost no airflow. In winter, humidity turned to icy dampness, and prisoners described the walls weeping with cold. Some were kept near the moat, where cold air from the Tiber River rolled in like fog. Others were held in small, circular cells once used for storing grain. A charming architectural detail that probably didn't feel quite so charming when you were trying to sleep in it. The Renaissance. Philosopher Giordano Bruno spent years imprisoned, there before his execution in 1600. He was known to wrap his cloak around himself, muttering that thought warms the spirit when the body cannot. A beautiful sentiment, though I doubt it helped much at 3 a.m. The Bastille, cold before. It was cool, the Bastille of Paris, yes. That Bastille was also a prison long before it became a revolutionary symbol. Originally built in the 14th century, it wasn't just a fortress. It was a statement. Look how much we can overcompensate with stone. The lower cells were notoriously cold. Because the Bastille's foundation was built over swampy ground, moisture seeped up from below. In the winter, it was like sleeping inside a refrigerator made of limestone. One 17th century inmate wrote that the dampness hangs in the air like breath and freezes upon the straw as dew. Noble prisoners, the kind who could still write, were usually allowed fires or even food deliveries from home. Ordinary ones? They froze quietly in their shared cells, trying to keep warm by wrapping themselves in rags or newspapers, the medieval equivalent of thermal wear. The irony, of course, is that the Bastille's destruction in 1789 was seen as liberation, yet by then, most of its prisoners were already gone, and the only thing left cold in there was the memory. Edinburgh Castle, cold north, colder nights. If you ever want to experience true medieval chill, skip Switzerland and France. Go straight to Scotland. Edinburgh Castle, perched high on its volcanic rock, was never meant for comfort. In winter, winds roar through its corridors like they're auditioning for a ghost movie. The old prison vaults beneath the castle were used for centuries, holding soldiers, debtors, and occasionally political traitors. During the 1700s, captured sailors, mostly from France, Spain, and America, were kept there. They left carvings on the wooden doors, ships, stars, initials, desperate art in a freezing world. Records describe the men lying 10 to a cell, with straw that rotted underfoot, and no fire but the breath of their bodies. In winter, the temperature in those vaults could fall near freezing. Prisoners huddled under thin blankets, eating salted meat and mouldy bread. And because the cells were underground, the cold never truly left. It just lived there waiting. If you visit today, guides sometimes joke that it's naturally air-conditioned. That's one way to put it. Crac des Chevaliers, the chilly Crusader fortress. Let's take a detour eastward, to Syria. Though this one's technically not European, it was built by Europeans, and it had all the same cold-hearted charm. Crac des Chevaliers was the great Crusader fortress of the 12th century, sitting high in the mountains. Winters there were harsh, and snow, rain, biting winds. The fortress had deep storage rooms and underground vaults used to hold prisoners. Even the knights complained about the temperature, and if they were freezing in armor and fur cloaks, the prisoners below probably resembled human popsicles. No official records survive of how prisoners slept there, but archaeologists found soot marks and straw remnants in the lower chambers, suggesting they burned anything flammable just to stay alive. Even in a fortress built for holy war, survival was still a matter of who got closest to the fire pit. Colder than death, the psychology of freezing. Let's pause for a second, because there's something strangely poetic and terrible about all this cold. Every one of these castles was designed for power. For strength, stone walls, iron doors, high towers, all symbols of control. But the cold didn't care about power. It reached everyone, from kings to peasants. The noble captive with his fur-lined cloak still shivered when the fire went out. The nameless thief in the oubliette dreamed of sunlight he'd never see. Even the guards, wrapped in cloaks, stamped their feet at night, waiting for dawn. The chill made everyone equal. It stripped away pride, comfort, and titles. It reminded every human in those castles, royal or wretched, that nature always wins in the end. And somehow, that feels almost peaceful. One last look, so picture this. It's midnight in a medieval castle. Maybe somewhere in France or Scotland. Snow drifts down outside. The nobles upstairs sleep near a roaring hearth, their dogs curled by their beds. Down below, under layers of stone, a prisoner lies on straw, or maybe just on the bare floor. He wraps his arms around himself. Breath fogging in the dark, he listens to the sound of dripping water and the faint echo of footsteps above. He thinks about summer, about sunlight, about warmth he might never feel again, and then, finally, maybe because the body can't stay awake anymore, he sleeps. Hey again, if you've made it this far, you probably deserve a medal, or at least a blanket, because tonight we're not talking about kings or torture chambers. We're talking about survival, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when the torches go out and the cold starts, whispering against your bones. You see, medieval prisons weren't designed for life. They were designed for waiting for trial, ransom, confession, or death. But in the waiting, people still lived. And when winter came crawling through the cracks, they found ways, strange, clever, desperate ways to stay warm. So, let's step back into those cells and watch what the human mind does when it refuses to freeze. One fire, smoke, and the price of Ashif, a medieval prisoner, was lucky enough to have friends or family with a little money. They could buy fire. Yes, fire. It was a luxury. In many European prisons, especially the Tower of London and France's Bastille, guards sold heating privileges. A few coins might earn you a candle, a small brazier, or even a bucket of charcoal. But there was a problem. The air in most dungeons barely moved. So when a prisoner lit a small fire, the smoke just hovered. It filled the cell, burned their eyes, coated their lungs, and turned their straw black. There are records of prisoners in Loch's castle who died not from cold but from smoke inhalation. Yet others kept burning their fires anyway, choosing choking warmth over clean, killing air. In Scotland's Edinburgh vaults, guards noticed that prisoners would burn anything: shoes, bits of rope, scraps of wood from the cell door. One report even mentions a group of French sailors tearing apart their wooden spoons and burning them piece by piece, each spoon lasting about 15 minutes of warmth, and when all else failed, they burned lice. Yes, lice. Chroniclers from the 1500s mention prisoners collecting lice from their rags, pressing them against candle flames, and laughing bitterly as the tiny pops sounded like applause. It wasn't about warmth, it was about control. A small rebellion against a freezing world. 2 ale wine and the myth of liquid warmth alcohol. The medieval cure for everything. Cold. Drink sad. Drink. Still cold. Drink again. In winter, prisoners, especially nobles, were often supplied with ale or watered wine. It was thought to warm the blood. And to be fair, it did, just not in a good way. Ale numbed the senses. It made the cold feel distant, but it also thinned the blood, dehydrated the body, and made frostbite even easier. Still, prisoners clung to it. In the Tower of London, Sir Walter Raleigh requested a jug of wine every night. "Better drunk and dreaming," he wrote, "than sober and freezing." In France, the Marquis de Sade, centuries later, was allowed to brew small batches of beer in his cell at Vincennes. The guards didn't stop him. They said the fermentation kept him occupied and his hands warm. It's a little poetic, isn't it? Even behind bars, people found a way to make warmth from fermentation and imagination. 3 straw. Rags and the blanket of rot. Most medieval prisoners slept on straw. It sounds rustic, maybe even comfortable, until you imagine that straw soaked in sweat, rainwater and human waste turning into a dark, mouldy mat. Still, it insulated better than stone. In Château, prisoners stuffed straw into their tunics, layering it under their rags. In Paris, inmates at the conciergerie wove old clothing into makeshift quilts. Sometimes they traded straw between cells, dry straw for damp, hoping to get a night or two of comfort. In one grim record from 14th century Rouen, a guard notes that the men tear their straw into cords, bind them about the legs and arms, can't sleep upright like sacks. That image sticks with me, half-frozen people standing or kneeling in the dark, bound up in straw ropes to hold in body heat, a primitive version of thermal wear made from desperation, and when the straw rotted too much to use, they burned it. The smell was awful, but for a few minutes the cell glowed like home, no for rats, cats, and unlikely companions. Loneliness freezes faster than skin, so sometimes warmth came from things that moved. Prison rats were hated, yes, but also strangely loved. A prisoner in Krakow once wrote that the rats sit close to my feet in winter, for they too seek the warmth. He began feeding them crumbs from his bread ration. Within weeks they would curl around his ankles at night. Not every jailer liked this arrangement, but others ignored it, because rats ate lice and fleas, and fewer insects meant fewer outbreaks of plague. In some castles, cats were kept to control rodents. Prisoners would whisper to them, stroke their fur, even name them. A few records from the Bastille mention cats sleeping on prisoners' chests, sharing breath. No one called it affection back then, but it was. Tiny alliances in a frozen world. 5. The body trick. Sleeping like a stone. Here's something fascinating. When people got too cold, their bodies adapted. Medieval. Prisoners didn't know the word hibernation, but they practiced something eerily. Close, chroniclers describe prisoners sleeping like beasts in winter, slowing their breath and heartbeats, drifting between wakefulness and a kind of frozen trance. Modern scientists would call it torpor, a semi-hibernation state where the body conserves energy. But back then, it was survival instinct. One monk imprisoned in northern Germany claimed he could sleep for 16 hours straight to escape the pain of the chill. He trained himself to breathe slowly, thinking warm thoughts of sunlight and bread ovens. Others prayed themselves to sleep, repeating verses rhythmically until the mind shut off the body's panic. It wasn't just faith, it was neuroscience. Medieval edition, Darwin 6. The art of movement. Some prisoners refused to sit still, they paced endlessly. In the Tower of London, the floor of Raleigh's cell was worn smooth from his nightly circuits, 50 steps back and forth, over and over to keep his blood moving. In France, the Jesuit priest Jean-Joseph Surin described how he marched as a soldier in a single place to drive away the freezing of the limbs. Even in total darkness, they kept walking, counting steps, muttering prayers, inventing songs, anything to keep the heart from slowing too much. And when exhaustion came, they collapsed on their straw, panting, and for an hour or two, they were warm. 7. Faith, imagination, and the heat of the mind. The strangest warmth of all wasn't physical, it was mental. Prisoners, in solitary confinement, often described hallucinating sunlight. They would sit in the dark and imagine standing in fields, hearing bees, feeling warmth on their faces. A 15th century knight imprisoned in Burgundy wrote, "When I picture my wife by the hearth, my heart stirs and my skin feels the fire she tends." Was it madness? Maybe. But it worked. Modern psychology confirms that vivid imagination can trigger real physical warmth. The brain sends false signals, tightening muscles and raising body temperature. So yes, even then, centuries before science caught up, people discovered that hope could literally heat the body. And maybe that's the most human trick of all. 8. The Winter Song's prisons were silent places, but not always. When cold set in, people sang, low, slow, murmuring songs that echoed through the stone. Sometimes they were prayers. Sometimes they were nonsense verses or folk melodies from home. In Italian prisons, guards complained that the singing keeps the men from despair but gives the place a ghostly air. In France, inmates of the conciergerie would hum in unison, using the vibration in their chests to create a shared warmth. Sound became a form of heat. It made you feel alive. It reminded you that you still had breath left to use. 9. The exchange of warmth. 1. Of the rarest, most moving accounts comes from a group of English prisoners taken during the 100 Years' War and held in a French dungeon. The chronicler wrote that they slept in embrace, 3 or 4 together, that their hearts might keep the blood in motion. They weren't lovers or friends, just strangers sharing survival. There's something haunting about that. Men who would have fought each other on a battlefield, now pressed together for warmth, breathing the same icy air. When morning came, they untangled quietly and pretended it hadn't happened. But in the dark, humanity always came first. The worst hour in those prisons wasn't midnight, it was dawn. That's when the fire went out, when the body gave up its heat, when frost settled on the straw like a second blanket. Guards would open the doors, and a faint grey light would creep in, revealing faces pale and hollow, breath hanging like ghosts. Some mornings, a prisoner wouldn't move. The others would simply pull his blanket over him and sit in silence, waiting for the sun that never reached their cell. And then life went on, because even in the coldest corners of history, people kept choosing to live. One more day, one more night, one more breath in the freezing dark. The quiet lesson. It's strange, isn't it? We read these stories and think of them as distant tragedies, old and grim, like the stones of the castles themselves. But the truth is, every human being back then wanted the same thing we do now: to be warm, to be seen, to last until morning. They found warmth in straw, in song, in rats and rags, in each other, and in a world built of cold iron and judgment. That was the real rebellion. Hey again, wanderer, if you're still here, either you're fascinated or you've fallen halfway asleep and can't find the stop button. Either way, welcome back. Tonight we're not talking about living prisoners anymore. We're going to the places they left behind, the cold rooms that stayed cold long after the bodies were gone, the dungeons where the air still seems to breathe and the walls somehow remember. Because here's a curious thing. Centuries after the chains rusted away and the torches went out, visitors still step into those old cells and swear they can feel something. Not ghosts exactly, though some insist otherwise. It's more like memory, built into the stone. Let's walk quietly through a few of those places tonight. One, the Tower of London, where the cold never left. Let's start with the most famous one, the Tower of London. People visit for the jewels, the ravens, the fancy yeoman warders in red coats. But underneath all that cheerful history, the tower has a climate problem. Certain cells, especially in the Wakefield and Beauchamp towers, stay unnaturally cold even during the summer. Thermal. Scans have shown that some spots are several degrees cooler than the rest of the corridor, even though there's no airflow difference. And visitors say it's not just cold, it's heavy, like walking through old breath. The guides laugh it off. They call it the ghost of drafty architecture. But every now and then, someone admits that, yes, it does feel occupied. One historian who stayed overnight in the Martin Tower said the temperature dropped suddenly around midnight, like someone had opened a window in winter. Except the window had been sealed for 400 years, and honestly, that's kind of perfect. A place where men and women froze, still holding its chill, refusing to let go. History with temperature control. 2. Château Castle, the damp heart of the lake. If you've been listening since the beginning, you'll remember Château Castle, the one built into the rock beside Lake Geneva. It's peaceful now. Tourists stroll through its stone corridors, admiring the view of the Alps, taking pictures where prisoners once sat in chains. But there's one room that never quite warms up, the lower dungeon. Even in July, when the sunlight hits the lake like glass, the air down there is cold and wet, smelling faintly of iron. You can see François Bonnivar's name carved into the pillar. He's the guy Byron wrote a poem about, and if you stand near it long enough, your breath fogs. Some say it's the humidity from the lake. Others say it's the memory of the water lapping against the cell floor for centuries, soaking into the stone. Personally, I like the idea that the lake is still listening, that it remembers the voices that echoed off its walls and keeps them cool, like secrets stored on ice. Loches Castle, the whispering air. Now let's float to France again. Loches Castle, in the Loire Valley, beautiful from the outside, terrifying underneath. Its dungeons are deep and oddly shaped, carved into limestone. The walls are so thick that even torches struggle to burn properly down there. Modern visitors say they can hear the cold, a soft hiss that sounds like air moving, even when nothing moves. When sound engineers tested it, they found that the rooms have a strange acoustic effect. Low frequencies linger for several seconds after any noise. So when you exhale, you actually hear your own breath echoing back. That's probably why so many medieval prisoners swore they heard whispering in the dark. It wasn't spirits. It was just the sound of themselves, looping back through the stone. Still, It's creepy and strangely sad, like the dungeon is trying to keep them company, even now. 4. Edinburgh's vaults. The cold beneath the city. Let's move north. To Edinburgh. Beneath the old town lies a labyrinth of vaults, arches and chambers sealed off for centuries. They were used for storage, then slums, then prisons, and if you go there now on one of those slightly theatrical ghost tours, they'll hand you a candle and tell you not to wander. The temperature difference is shocking. You leave a bustling street full of light and sound, step into the vaults, and the world drops 10 degrees. Your voice echoes like it's been swallowed. The walls drip, and sometimes the cold doesn't fade when you leave. It clings. Historians say it's simple: trapped air, moisture, and lack of sunlight. But tour guides still talk about the cold that follows, a shiver that sticks in your spine, as if something invisible climbed out with you. It's a little dramatic. But then again, everything about medieval prisons was dramatic, just very slowly, very quietly dramatic. 5. The ice cells of Nuremberg in Nuremberg. Germany, there's a peculiar part of the old castle called the Eisgrube, or ice pit. It wasn't technically a prison, but it was used as one during crises. The chamber sits below ground, half stone, half clay, with no ventilation at all. Temperature sensors placed there today record some of the coldest readings in any European ruin, barely above freezing even in midsummer. When prisoners were kept there, they described the air as alive. It wasn't just cold, it moved. That's the strange thing about deep underground cells. The difference in pressure between surface air and subterranean air creates a faint breeze that feels like someone breathing beside you. So picture it, sitting in the dark, the air brushing your cheek every few seconds, whispering softly. You'd go a little mad, or maybe you'd start whispering back. 6. The Bastille, the cold of bureaucracy. And then there's the Bastille. Destroyed in 1789, yes, but for centuries before that, it was the ultimate symbol of cold authority. The Bastille wasn't the coldest dungeon physically, but emotionally. It was glacial. Prisoners there weren't tortured. They were simply forgotten. One man, the Marquis de Caumont, wrote that his cell was cold as indifference. He wasn't exaggerating. The walls were lined with damp plaster that never dried, and his only view was a slit of light that showed the seasons changing, but never reached him. When the Bastille fell, witnesses described the interior as humid and foul, like the breath of an old tomb. And the odd thing, even years later when they built houses over the site, residents complained that their basements stayed icy, a whole neighborhood haunted by the chill of paperwork and lost time. 7. The cold that tells stories. So why does this matter? Why care about a few degrees of temperature in old stone rooms? Because the cold is history you can feel. You can read about kings, wars, and treaties forever, but it's hard to imagine what life felt like. The cold makes it real. It reminds you that every historical figure, every nameless prisoner had skin, breath, and a heartbeat that could stop from frost as easily as from a sword. Sometimes when archaeologists enter a sealed chamber for the first time in centuries, they describe a strange feeling, a sudden drop in temperature, followed by silence so complete it almost hums. They say it feels like entering someone's last breath. Maybe that's superstition, maybe it's physics, but either way, it's memory, condensed into air. The science of haunted cold, all right. Let's be boringly rational for a moment. Why do these places stay cold? Stone holds temperature, especially limestone and granite, which are dense and slow to change. Moisture from underground seepage adds humidity, which makes air feel colder to human skin. And old castles were built with airflow in mind, to carry smoke, to keep mold down, to prevent fires. That means endless tiny drafts. Put all that together, and you get perpetual chill. No spirits required, but the human mind doesn't like simple answers. We feel something in that cold, a presence, a heaviness, and we call it haunting. And honestly, that's fair. Because if thousands of people suffered, whispered, prayed, and froze in one place for hundreds of years, it's not strange to think the air learned their language. 9. When the tourists leave, modern castles close early. By evening, the crowds are gone. The lights turn off. The guides lock the gates, and in that silence, the air changes again. The walls release the day's warmth slowly, sighing back into their natural temperature. Cold, steady, patient. Guards doing night rounds in the tower, Chillon, or Warwick sometimes talk about hearing soft clinks or faint breathing. Usually, it's pipes or settling stone, but there's something poetic in that too, because it means the place still moves, still breathes, in its own way. You can't bury centuries of fear, prayer, and whispered songs under a gift shop. History doesn't leave. It just cools down. The philosophy of the chill. If you think about it, the cold is the perfect historian. It preserves. Heat destroys. Fire burns the archives. Cold keeps everything. The wood, the ink, the bones, the echoes exactly as they were. So when we step into a freezing dungeon and feel that sudden prickle of goosebumps, maybe we're not sensing ghosts at all. Maybe we're just touching the past directly. Every stone wall that's held human breath for 1,000 winters remembers that warmth. It's still there, just inverted, like a photograph in negative. A warmth turned to memory, a life turned to air. So if you ever visit a medieval castle, and you find yourself in a cold spot that feels a little too cold, don't panic. Don't think about ghosts or tragedies. Just remember that someone once stood exactly there, shivering, breathing, wishing for dawn. You're sharing the same air, the same silence, the same small miracle of being alive in a cold stone world. Hey there, still awake? If you are, congratulations. You've officially survived multiple nights in the medieval underworld. You've endured damp stone, flickering torches, and the faint smell of despair. So, how about we climb a few stairs? Let's leave the dungeons behind for a bit. Because while prisoners were shivering on straw and whispering to rats, something very different was happening upstairs. It's one of the quiet ironies of castle life. Above every cold, filthy cell, there was probably a room so warm and luxurious it could make modern hotels look primitive. So tonight, let's explore the other side of those walls, where the air was perfumed, the fires were bright, and the blankets were made of actual animal fur, because nothing says royalty quite like sleeping comfortably above your own human refrigerator. Won the castle as a layer cake. A medieval castle was basically a vertical class system. At the top, quite literally, was the solar or the Lord's private chamber. It was usually built on the highest floor, right above the great hall, warm, bright, and thick with rugs and tapestries. Below that were the servants' quarters, smaller, colder, but still livable. Then came the storerooms and kitchens, where heat from the ovens helped a little. And below that, the dungeons. It's oddly symbolic, isn't it? Every layer colder, darker, and poorer the further down you went. A literal diagram of feudal society, drawn in temperature gradients. If you were lucky, you were near the fire. If you weren't, you became a historical temperature statistic. 2. The bed of a king now. Let's talk about beds. Because medieval royalty didn't just sleep. They performed sleep. A noble bed wasn't just a mattress. It was an entire piece of architecture. Huge carved frames, heavy curtains, embroidered canopies, basically a small, portable room within a room, and they didn't sleep alone. Oh no, the lord and lady often shared their chamber with attendants, guards, and sometimes even guests. Privacy was a luxury even wealth couldn't fully buy. But warmth was the trade-off. Curtains were drawn tight to trap heat. Multiple feather mattresses were stacked high enough that climbing into bed required a step stool. And those thick fur blankets, often layered with fox, marten, or ermine, the medieval version of a five-star duvet. Meanwhile, in the dungeon below, a man was probably wrapping straw around his legs and humming to himself for warmth. It's all about contrast. The upstairs snored softly. The downstairs prayed for spring. Their firelight hierarchies. Fireplaces were the medieval status symbol. The more fireplaces your room had, the higher your rank. The great hall might have one massive hearth in the center always burning, sending smoke up through the rafters. But the real luxury was the private hearth, a small, carved fireplace inside a personal chamber. Stone chimneys became fashionable around the 13th century, and once nobles could have fires in their own rooms, they went a little overboard. Some castles, like Hever or Hedingham, had hearths so big you could walk inside them. Others were delicately designed with carved angels or saints peeking from the corners, which must have been comforting or awkward, depending on your evening plans. And yes, fires were expensive. A wealthy household burned through forests' worth of wood each winter. Meanwhile, prisoners below were buying candle stubs with their last coin. Because, you know, to balance macrame, royal pajamas, sort of. When it came to sleepwear, medieval nobles weren't exactly in satin nightgowns. Most just wore linen shifts or under tunics, basically their version of long pajamas. But here's where things got interesting. Nobles believed drafts were evil. They thought that cold air caused disease. Bad humors, as the doctors called them, so they went to absurd lengths to block every breeze. Tapestries covered walls, canopies hung low over beds. Even the keyholes were sometimes stuffed with bits of cloth, and still, they weren't entirely warm. Stone is stone. Even luxury can only do so much against a 14th century January. So they added layers, fur robes, velvet slippers, even sleeping hoods with flaps to cover the ears. Yes, medieval kings basically went to bed looking like sleepy wizards, but at least they were warm. 5. Hot stones and heated sheets. Before electric blankets, there were bricks. Heated bricks wrapped in cloth, tucked into the bed to take the chill off the sheets. It was a simple idea, but surprisingly effective. In some wealthier castles, servants would carry metal pans filled with embers, sliding them between the linens before bedtime, like primitive heating pads. The more paranoid nobles had the pans checked for poison first, because of course they did. Medieval life was basically a full-time trust exercise. Down in the dungeon, the only heated stone you got was the one your body had been sitting on all day. But for the upper floors, warmth was a carefully managed luxury. It was part of the nightly ritual, prayers, servants, firelight, and a slow descent into drowsy comfort, while somewhere below, silence stretched over the freezing dark. 6. The smell of warmth. Here's something people forget. Warmth had a smell. Castle fires weren't clean. They burned wood, peat, sometimes even animal dung. The air upstairs was warm, yes, but smoky, thick with ash, wax, and perfume meant to cover it up. The nobility loved incense and scented oils. Lavender, rosemary, rosewater, all used to mask the stench of smoke and humanity. In the great halls, Rushes were strewn on the floor, sprinkled with herbs to keep things fresh. It didn't really work, but it gave the illusion of care. And maybe that's the point. Luxury wasn't about comfort. It was about pretending discomfort was beneath you. So while prisoners below coughed in smoke-filled cells, the lords above did the same, only with nicer smells. Our sleeping in shifts, a surprising thing. Medieval sleep wasn't one long stretch. People usually had two sleeps, first sleep and second sleep. They'd go to bed around sunset, wake up around midnight, pray, talk, or even snack, and then drift off again until dawn. In castles, that midnight break was often when servants added more logs to the fires, a small nighttime ritual to keep the chill away. Meanwhile, below prisoners woke too, but not from luxury. The cold woke them, the pain in their fingers, the ache in their bones. Different reasons, same sleepless night. It's funny how even when divided by stone, the rhythms of human life matched. Everyone fought the same darkness, just with different tools. The servants' winter. Now, let's spare a thought for the in-betweeners, the servants. They weren't royalty, but they weren't prisoners either. They slept in narrow rooms near the kitchens or under staircases, sometimes 4 or 5 to a bed. They got the leftovers of the castle's warmth, drifting up from ovens, down from fires, sideways through cracks in the walls. They lived in the thermal middle class. Servants were the ones who made the fires, carried the wood, cleaned the ashes, and often slept closest to the heat sources. So ironically, while the lords dreamed under fur blankets, the scullery maids were probably warmer, simply because they slept next to the oven. There's a kind of cosmic balance in that. 9. The morning divide. Mornings in a castle were a study in contrast. Upstairs, the noble chambers glowed softly with firelight. Servants entered quietly to relight the hearth, lay out clothes and bring warm wine or broth. Downstairs, in the dungeon, the only warmth was breath, and maybe, if the sun was merciful, a few thin rays creeping through a slit in the wall. For one world, the day began with velvet slippers and steaming cups. For the other, it began with frost and silence. It's strange to think those two worlds existed in the same building, separated by a few flights of stairs, but by entire universes of privilege. 10. The philosophy of comfort. Here's a thought that might put you to sleep, or keep you up, depending on your conscience. In every age, warmth has been the measure of power. The ability to choose temperature, to say I am too cold and have someone fix it. That's the real luxury. For medieval nobles, heat was proof of status. For prisoners, cold was a punishment. And even now, centuries later, the same pattern lingers in quieter ways. Who gets warmth easily? Who has to fight for it? History is, in the end, just a long argument about who gets to sleep comfortably. Hey again. If you're still awake, that's impressive. You've officially lasted longer than most medieval guards on a winter night. So, let's step quietly now. The fires have burned low. The great hall is silent except for the faint crackle of cooling logs. Everyone's asleep, except for a handful of poor souls pacing the walls outside, trying very hard not to freeze to death. Welcome to the night watch. The coldest job in the kingdom. Being a medieval castle guard sounds glamorous in stories, all shining armor and heroic duty. In reality, it was mostly just standing around in the dark, in the cold for hours. You didn't get the nice fur blankets or feather mattresses. You got chainmail that felt like wearing a refrigerator. You got boots stiff with frost and torches that smoked more than they burned. And if you were lucky, maybe a small brazier, a pot of glowing coals to warm your hands. But even that was a luxury. Most guards just stamped their feet and muttered prayers to Saint whoever was listening. Because in a stone castle, at midnight in January, there were no cozy corners. 2. The endless loop of stay awake. Guards were expected to walk the walls, check the gates and keep an eye out for, well, anything. But most nights, anything didn't happen. There were no sieges, no attacks, no grand adventures, just the steady sound of wind sliding along the battlements. The only real enemy was sleep, and medieval people took that seriously. If you fell asleep on duty, it wasn't just embarrassing, it could get you executed. Neglecting a post during wartime was considered treason. So, imagine, you're freezing. Your torch keeps going out, the castle is dead quiet, and the only thing louder than the wind is your own yawning. You blink once, twice. Then a voice behind you. Still awake, soldier? You snap to attention, heart pounding. Yes, definitely awake. Totally alert, just meditating with your eyes closed for warmth. 3. The sound of a sleeping castle. Night inside a castle wasn't silent. It breathed. Timbers creaked, fires popped. Wind moaned through arrow slits. Dogs shuffled in the courtyard. And somewhere water dripped, and always dripping. Guards learned to tell normal sounds from dangerous ones. Fox in the yard sounded different from a footstep. A gust through a chimney wasn't. The same as a door moving, you became part of the building. Every echo had meaning, every shadow had a personality. And yet, despite the training, the imagination was always stronger. 4. Ghosts on the ramparts. Castles were full of ghosts, or at least, everyone thought so. If you'd seen half the things that happened in medieval castles, you'd probably haunt them too. Guards told endless stories to pass the time. A pale lady who wandered the West Tower. A headless monk seen in the chapel at midnight. Chains. Rattling in empty corridors. Most of it was wind and fatigue, but the line between tired and terrified gets blurry when your teeth are chattering. And so, a guard might tighten his cloak and whisper, "Just the breeze," and but still, he'd walk a little faster past the chapel door. 5. Night routines. Every castle had its own system for night shifts. Some divided the hours into watches. Early watch, middle watch and late watch, each lasting maybe 3 or 4 hours. At the start of the night, a captain would call the roll, making sure everyone was present and sober. Then torches were handed out, gates were locked, and the castle became a world unto itself. Guards on the outer walls had the worst time of it. The wind cut straight through the crenellations, and frost formed on helmets. Inside guards fared better. They patrolled the corridors, checked the Great Hall, and guarded doors to private chambers. A few might even doze in corners if they had a friendly superior, but nobody really rested. Even half asleep, you had to listen. For footsteps, for voices, for anything unusual. And sometimes, unusual came knocking. When the prisoners stirred, prisoners didn't exactly have bedtime schedules. They groaned, coughed, prayed, and occasionally screamed. Sound carried strangely through stone. It could echo up through floors and corridors. A guard might hear a faint cry at 2 in the morning. Somewhere deep below, he'd grip his torch, hesitate, then shake his head. Probably nothing. Just the wind, but sometimes it wasn't nothing. Escape attempts did happen, rare as they were. A loose stone, a stolen nail, a desperate climb, and that's when the cold stopped mattering. Because chasing a half-starved fugitive through torchlight, tunnels was a lot less boring than standing. Still, but infinitely worse for your nerves. Still, most nights passed without excitement, just the rhythm of boots on stone and the quiet mutter of breath freezing in the air. 97. The midnight meals. Around midnight, guards were sometimes allowed a small snack, bread, cheese, maybe ale. Not for pleasure, but to stay awake. Cold made people hungry, and hunger made people cold. It was a cruel loop. So they ate in shifts, huddled near whatever warmth they could find, talking softly about nonsense. Who was drunk last week? Who owed money? Who might marry the baker's daughter? It was the sound of humanity holding back the cold with words, and sometimes that was enough. 8. The smell of frost and iron. If you could somehow step into a medieval night watch, the first thing you'd notice isn't the silence, it's the smell. Cold metal, wet stone, smoke from torches. And underneath, the faint odor of oil, leather, and exhaustion. Armor wasn't comfortable to wear for long. The straps bit into your shoulders. The weight never went away. And in winter, the metal froze against your skin. Dads, sometimes stuffed cloth under their mail or wrapped rags around exposed fingers. There were no gloves thick enough for that kind of cold. But you didn't complain, not out loud. The walls heard everything. Tight, the loneliness of the ramparts. Every now and then a guard would stop walking and just look out into the dark, at the forests or fields stretching away under moonlight. Nothing moved, just endless quiet, the kind that made you aware of your heartbeat. It was easy to feel small up there, a single figure keeping watch over centuries of silence. Sometimes, guards carved little marks into the stone, initials, dates, prayers, tiny graffiti to say I existed. And hundreds of years later, archaeologists find them, still there, in corners where the wind still whispers the same tune. It's oddly touching, these forgotten signatures of cold. Sleepless men. 10. The changing of the watch, finally. The hourglass ran out. The new watch climbed the stairs, torches flickering. The old guard stepped aside, stiff and half-frozen, muttering thanks to any god who'd listen. They'd hand over their weapons, salute, and shuffle inside toward the kitchen, or anywhere warm. Sometimes they'd sleep on benches near the fire, armor still on, snoring softly while others took their place, a quiet rotation of exhaustion. The night went on. The castle breathed, and history, as usual, didn't notice. 11. Dawn. Over the parapets, the first light of dawn wasn't dramatic. It came slowly, pale and grey, sliding over the battlements like a sigh. The birds woke first, then the dogs, then the kitchen staff. By the time the Lord stirred in his feather bed, the guards had already walked miles in circles. They'd seen stars fade, frost melt, and smoke rise from the chimneys. They'd earned their sleep, though sleep for a guard was more like passing out until someone yelled for help. And yet, there was something oddly peaceful in that routine, to be awake while the world slept, to watch the dark fade away, one frost-covered stone at a time. Maybe in their own quiet way, they were the real historians, keeping silent company with the centuries. So, the next time you visit a castle, look up at those towers and walls. Imagine the night, the creak of armor, the crunch of boots on ice, the glow of a single torch in a sea of black. Someone was up there once, shivering and staring into the dark, hoping morning would hurry up. And when it finally came, all they got was another day of doing it again. Medieval glamour, right? Hey again. We've wandered the dungeons, shivered on the ramparts, and tiptoed through noble bedrooms. Now, let's go somewhere a little cozier. Because while half the castle froze in silence, there was one room that never truly slept, one room that always glowed. The kitchen, a place of smoke, fire, shouting, and, depending on the cook's mood, the occasional flying ladle. But also, the one reliable source of warmth in the entire castle. So, pull your cloak tighter and follow the smell of wood smoke. We're going to the only spot where the fire never went out. 1. The castle's beating heart. The kitchen was usually tucked away in its own wing, partly for convenience, partly to prevent the whole castle from burning down. Stone walls, high ceilings, and chimneys the size of small caves. In winter, it became the castle's heart. If you stood anywhere nearby, you could feel its warmth pulsing faintly through the stone floors. Everyone knew where to go when their hands went numb. The kitchen doorway. It was unofficial policy that someone, a guard, a servant, a wandering stable boy, would always find an excuse to check on the cooks around midnight, and the cooks pretended not to notice. As long as you didn't touch the stew, you could thaw your fingers in peace. To a controlled chaos, a medieval kitchen was never quiet. There were pots bubbling over open, flames, knives clattering on boards, servants arguing about who forgot to fetch water from the well. Even in the middle of the night, something was always happening. Bread had to rise, broth had to simmer. The morning meal had to be ready before dawn. So while the lords dreamed upstairs and the guards froze outside, the kitchen was awake, smelling of meat, smoke, and human fatigue. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood the head cook, usually round, loud and perpetually annoyed, the kind of person who could command both respect and absolute terror with a single look, because feeding a castle was not a small task, and neither was keeping it warm. 3. The fire that never died. The kitchen fire was sacred. It was started in autumn, and ideally it never went out until spring. Once lit, it became a living thing. Cooks fed it carefully, adding logs, stirring embers, whispering mild curses when it smoked too much. If the fire did go out, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was bad luck. Some kitchens even had a designated fire tender, whose sole job was to keep the coals alive overnight. They'd sleep beside it, wrapped in rags, turning logs with half-closed eyes. In exchange, they got the warmest bed in the castle, if you could call a corner of soot and ashes a bed. Still, compared to the dungeon, it was paradise. 4. The smell of comfort. Let's talk about that smell, because it was the closest thing medieval life had to happiness. Roasting meat. Fresh bread, wood smoke, a hint of spilled ale. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your dreams. Even the prisoners could sometimes catch a whiff through cracks in the floor and imagine a world beyond straw and mold. And for servants, the kitchen smell meant safety. It meant heat, food, and company. No matter how chaotic things got, that smell was home. It's strange, isn't it? How centuries later, a loaf of bread still smells like comfort. Maybe because back then, it was survival. 5. The night crew. While most of the castle slept, the kitchen crew worked. The baker started first, long before dawn, grinding flour, mixing dough, sweating beside the ovens. Bread was essential. You couldn't have a medieval breakfast without it. Then came the pot boys, the scullery maids and the apprentices. They scrubbed, chopped, carried, fetched, and mostly got yelled at. The kitchen hierarchy was its own tiny kingdom. At the top, the cook, wielding authority like a cleaver. At the bottom, the poor souls whose main job was cleaning fish guts. And somewhere in between were the kitchen boys, half-starved, half asleep, constantly stealing crumbs when no one looked. You can almost hear it, can't you? The hiss of the fire, the low murmur of voices, the occasional thump of a pot hitting the table too hard. It was loud, messy, human, but it was alive. The warmth everyone borrowed. Word spread. Fast when the kitchen was quiet, guards would drift in from their posts. Servants from the cold corridors would wander in by accident. Sometimes even a visiting monk or messenger would appear, claiming to be just checking the stores. And the cooks, pretending not to see, would grunt and keep working, because everyone knew the kitchen wasn't just a place for food. It was the castle's unofficial fireplace. People came to warm hands, trade gossip, and exist in the one place that didn't feel entirely medieval. And as long as you didn't get in the cook's way, you were welcome. That was the unspoken rule. 7. The ritual of soup. Every winter night had one sacred act, the making of soup. Big pot. Whatever ingredients survived the week, bones, turnips, stale bread, herbs, a splash of ale if the cook was generous. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hot. And in a castle where warmth was a luxury, hot food meant everything. Guards, servants, even the occasional priest, they all drifted in for a ladle of soup before heading back to their posts. No one asked where it came from. No one paid. It was just understood. The kitchen fed whoever was cold enough to ask. And in its own quiet way, that was the castle's most human tradition. 8. The strange comfort of routine. The kitchen didn't change much through the centuries. Different rulers, different wars, same soup, same smoke, same exhaustion. And maybe that's what kept people sane. The guards outside measured time by the moon. The prisoners below measured it by silence, but the kitchen measured it by meals. Bread baked, stew stirred, fire fed, every day, every night, the same cycle. And somehow, that small predictability was its own kind of peace. When the world was unstable, politically, literally, climatically, the kitchen was constant. It might be smoky, loud and full of arguments, but it was reliable. A small island of warmth in a cold, unpredictable age. 9. The morning rush by dawn. The kitchen was in full chaos again. The morning meal had to be ready before the Lord woke up. Servants clattered, knives flashed, dogs barked, and the cook bellowed orders that could probably be heard from the next kingdom over. Porridge for the household, meat for the Lord, bread for the guards, leftovers for the rest. The air grew thick with heat and noise. Condensation ran down the walls, and outside, frost melted from the windows, the only proof that something warm was still alive inside these ancient stones. By the time the first nobles yawned awake, the kitchen had already been working for hours, and when the great hall filled with laughter and silver plates, the cooks disappeared back into the heat, invisible again. The hidden heartbeat of the castle, muffled by the walls above. 10. The fire's secret memory. When everyone else finally slept, when the guards changed shifts and the servants vanished to their straw beds, the kitchen fire still burned. It glowed faintly, half asleep, surrounded by ashes and quiet. If you stared long enough, you might almost think it was breathing. And maybe it was. Maybe every castle fire remembers. The footsteps, the laughter, the exhaustion, the centuries of hands feeding it wood. Long after the people are gone, the hearths remain, cold now but never truly dead, because once upon a time they were the only warmth that never gave up. So, when you visit a castle ruin and see a great, blackened fireplace, imagine the life that once flickered. There the cooks arguing, the guards thawing their hands, The prisoners, dreaming of warmth they'd never reach. The kitchen fire didn't just cook meals, it kept the human story burning quietly, patiently through every frozen night. The coldest corners, winter survival in the dungeons. All right, let's settle back down. We've drifted through tapestries and royal bedrooms, through corridors where the fire died out centuries ago. But now we're going deeper, into the dark, damp, echoing heart of the medieval castle, the dungeon. Or, as the prisoners probably called it, that miserable hole where hope goes to die. Let's talk about where prisoners actually slept during those charming European winters that could freeze your soul right out of your body. The first thing to understand is that dungeon didn't always mean what Hollywood thinks it means. Early medieval castles didn't even have proper underground torture caves. Most prisoners were just tossed into a spare tower room, sometimes called a guardrobe cell, because it was literally next to the toilet shaft. Yes, they were stored like unwanted garments beside the royal plumbing system, because why waste a perfectly good drafty corner? Now later on, as castles became more fortified, architects started building oubliettes. The French name literally means to forget, which tells you everything about their customer service policy. An oubliette wasn't really meant for long-term housing. It was more like a medieval do not disturb sign. Drop a person in there, forget they exist, and let nature do the rest. But if you were lucky, and lucky is doing a lot of work here, you might be kept in a more traditional prison cell. Usually a windowless stone room, maybe 6 feet by 8, with walls thick enough to block any sound of human dignity trying to escape. So, where did they sleep? On the floor, and no, not even a nice floor. We're talking about stone slabs that held onto cold like a grudge. In the dead of winter, the walls would literally frost over. The air was damp enough to make breathing feel like drinking water, and the smell, like let's just say earthy, doesn't cover it. Imagine centuries of rot, mildew, and human despair all marinating together. If the jailer was feeling merciful, you might get a thin layer of straw. Of course, the straw was more like a collection of semi-decayed farm leftovers, sometimes reused from a horse stable. Soft? No. Clean? Definitely not. Warm? Not even close. The straw would rot quickly from body heat and sweat, turning into a moldy compost pile that doubled as a bed. And here's the fun part. Lice, fleas, and rats adored it. Many prisoners described feeling the straw move beneath them at night, which, as you can imagine, was not comforting. But let's say you were a noble prisoner, not a peasant, not a random criminal, but someone politically important. Your stay in captivity would look a little different. Kings, queens, and knights taken in battle were sometimes given honorable imprisonment. You might get a proper bed, maybe even a fireplace if you were very high-ranking. Think of it as the VIP dungeon suite, still awful but slightly less fatal. For example, King Richard the Lionheart, when captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, was held in a series of castles where he had at least basic comforts: fire, bread, and a bed. Not luxurious, but survivable, because ransom money was only good if the prisoner lived long enough to pay it. Meanwhile, your average foot soldier or accused thief down below, they'd be curled up in rags, shivering so hard they could barely sleep. Frostbite was common. People's fingers and toes blackened in the cold. And sometimes they simply didn't wake up in the morning. Winter was the silent executioner. No sword, no noose, just time and temperature. Many castles were built on hills, which meant the dungeons sat at the lowest level, often below the water table. That meant icy groundwater seeping through cracks, making the air so cold and wet that metal chains would freeze to the skin. Prisoners sometimes tried to move as little as possible, just to conserve body heat. One chronicler in the 14th century wrote that prisoners in winter would lie like dogs, wrapped in their own filth, and praised death as mercy. And that wasn't even the worst description on record. Some dungeons were deliberately designed to be inhospitable, windowless, wet, and constantly dripping from condensation. A medieval architect would probably call it self-cleaning. Now you might wonder, did they have any way to stay warm? Any blankets, fires? Not really. Fire was considered a privilege, not a necessity. Guards didn't want the risk of smoke, escape, or comfort. So the only warmth came from human bodies, huddled together like unwanted puppies. Some even buried themselves halfway in the straw to trap warmth, though that also meant getting bitten by whatever else was living in it. Few records mention prisoners fashioning makeshift cloaks out of old rags, or even the tattered remains of their own clothes. But mostly they just endured, shivering, half asleep, half alive, drifting in and out of consciousness to the rhythm of dripping water. And when food came, it was cold too, bread so hard it could be used as a weapon, and water that froze in the jug overnight. Some tried to sleep simply to avoid feeling hunger. Others couldn't, because the cold made their muscles cramp. You start to understand why medieval punishments didn't always need torture devices. The climate did half the job for them. Of course, there were exceptions, places where jailers showed an odd streak of humanity. Some castles, like the Tower of London, had a range of prisoner experiences. The noble might have a chamber with a bed and writing desk, while commoners slept in dungeons so cold the guards rotated shifts just to avoid staying there too long. The contrast was brutal. Imagine one man sipping wine beside a fire upstairs, while another froze to death a few floors below. Both technically prisoners, just not of the same class. Over time, a few castles introduced small comforts. A bit more straw, maybe a blanket, or a hole in the wall that almost counted as ventilation. But these were gestures, not solutions. For most, the dungeon was a slow-motion death sentence, and winter just sped it up. And yet somehow there were survivors, people who endured years in these conditions. Some even wrote about it later, describing winters that felt like eternity. The trick, they said, was to never stop moving. Even in chains, they'd stamp their feet, slap their arms, and pace small circles just to keep the blood flowing. It wasn't just a fight for warmth, it was a fight to stay human. Because once the cold numbed everything, once you stopped caring about the rats or the frost or the smell, that's when people gave up. Let's float a bit higher now, out of those dark corridors, up through the stone ceilings and into the wind again. Because while the prisoners were freezing below, the guards weren't exactly cozy either. They stood on battlements where the wind cut through armor like knives. Their fires smoked more than they burned, and sometimes the only warmth they got was from pacing in circles. Castles weren't homes. They were fortresses designed to survive enemies, not the weather. But we'll get to that in the next stretch, where we'll explore how castle life above ground wasn't exactly much warmer, and how people tried, failed, and tried again to fight the endless chill of a medieval winter. So take a breath. Maybe pull your blanket a little tighter. We're not done with the cold just yet. Firelight, frost, and the endless draught. How everyone else survived the winter all right. You've made it out of the dungeon. Congratulations. Let's shake off the frostbite and take a slow walk back up through the castle corridors. Because as it turns out, life above ground wasn't exactly tropical either. Now movies love to show castles as cozy places. You know the vibe. A roaring fireplace, soft furs, a few candles, maybe a golden goblet of mulled wine in hand. But in reality, medieval castles were about as warm and comfortable as a damp cave with a tax system. Most castles were made of stone, thick, cold, and excellent at holding on to moisture. In winter, that meant the entire building became one massive refrigerator. The walls oozed with condensation. Your breath hung in the air like ghost fog. And no matter how big the fire was, the heat never really reached more than a few feet away. So, let's talk about how people, guards, servants, and even royalty, tried to survive it. Fireplaces were the obvious starting point. They were basically giant open boxes built into walls, often wide enough to roast an entire pig. But the design wasn't efficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney, which was fine if you were a chimney, but not great if you were trying to stay warm. People would huddle as close as possible to the flames. You could tell who got the best spots by who didn't have icicles on their nose. The further from the hearth, the colder it got. Servants often described the back of their bodies freezing while their faces burned. A sort of medieval rotisserie experience. And then there was the smoke. Oh, the smoke. Medieval chimneys were temperamental at best. Sometimes they didn't draw properly, and the entire room would fill with a lovely mix of soot, ash, and regret. People's clothes, hair, and lungs absorbed it all. So if the cold didn't get you, the coughing might. Servants, of course, got the worst of it. They slept wherever there was space. Hallways, kitchens, even near the stables for a bit of warmth from the animals. Yes, that's right. In winter, the stable was prime real estate. Horses gave off heat, and as long as you didn't mind the smell, which, let's be honest, everyone already smelled bad anyway, it was a decent survival strategy. Guards were another story. They spent most of their shifts outside, patrolling the walls or standing by gates. To stay warm, they layered up. Wool, leather, sometimes fur if they could afford it. But armor wasn't made for comfort. It trapped sweat, froze in the cold, and made your skin feel like metal itself. To keep their hands from freezing, guards often carried small iron pots filled with coals, known as hand warmers. Except they weren't really that warm and occasionally caught things on fire. Nothing says job hazard like accidentally igniting your gloves. Now for the highborn, kings, queens, nobles, life was a bit warmer, though still miserable by modern standards. Royal chambers had the biggest fireplaces in the castle. But remember, stone walls don't insulate. They absorb. So even if the fire was roaring, the heat vanished fast. That's why beds were so important. Medieval beds weren't just for sleeping. They were survival machines. Let's build one together in your mind. First, a massive wooden frame, carved and heavy enough to survive an earthquake. Then layers upon layers of bedding, a straw mattress at the bottom. Then a feather mattress if you were rich, topped with blankets, furs, and thick linen sheets, and finally, the pièce de résistance, the bed curtains. These weren't decorative. They were practical. Thick drapes enclosed the bed, trapping the body heat inside. Think of it as an early version of central heating, powered entirely by your own shivering. Once you were inside and the curtains were closed, the air would warm up enough that you could almost pretend you weren't living in a castle-sized freezer. Some nobles even had warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets before bedtime. Cozy in theory, deadly in practice. If you fell asleep with one inside, there was a good chance you'd wake up on fire. In fact, a few historical records note noblewomen catching their sheets aflame because the servant forgot to remove the warming pan. There's beauty sleep, and then there's crispy sleep. But even with all that, the cold seeped in. It always did. People slept in layers of clothing. Yes, in their clothes. Nightshirts, hats, gloves, even shoes sometimes. A medieval bedtime outfit looked more like something you'd wear to climb a snowy mountain than to tuck in for the night. Servants had it worse. They often slept in shared quarters, packed tightly to conserve heat. Some slept 2 or 3 to a bed, not out of affection, but survival. Body heat economy, if you will. And yet, despite all this, the cold was still relentless. Ink froze in the inkwells. Ale turned to slush. Bread went rock hard. People learned to accept that their winters would be an exercise in controlled misery. They tried small tricks. hanging tapestries on the walls to stop drafts, stuffing cracks with moss or rags, even bringing livestock indoors for warmth. Imagine dining with a cow nearby because she doubled as your heater. Medieval life was, let's say, innovatively unhygienic. And then there was the psychological side. Winter wasn't just physically hard, it was mentally exhausting. Short days, endless nights, and cold that made every task harder. People slept longer, worked less, and prayed more. Because when everything around you freezes, faith was about the only thing that felt warm. Still, there was one place in the castle that almost stayed warm all year round: the kitchen. The kitchen was a paradise by medieval standards. Fires burning all day, ovens glowing, pots simmering. Servants often volunteered to work there just to thaw their fingers. The downside? The smell of food was torture if you weren't allowed to eat it. Sometimes guards or minor servants would sneak into the kitchen at night to warm up for a few minutes. Risky, but worth it. You could lose your job for stealing a loaf of bread. But you could also lose your toes from frostbite if you didn't. And that's the thing about medieval life. It was a constant trade-off between discomforts. You chose your suffering. Hunger or cold, smoke or frost, lice or loneliness. Meanwhile, the wealthy hosted banquets in half-warm halls, pretending the chill didn't exist. They drank hot-spiced wine, wore fur-lined robes, and congratulated themselves for surviving another winter, as if comfort was a moral victory. But even kings couldn't ignore the draft that snuck under the doors. There's a wonderful irony there. All that power, all that gold, and yet they couldn't stop the wind from blowing out their candles. So when you picture a medieval castle, don't think of warmth and firelight. Think of echoes, dripping ceilings, and the sound of teeth chattering in perfect harmony. And perhaps that's why, in old records, winter always seems to carry a certain reverence, because if you made it through one, you'd earned it. Now let's drift further, to the quiet routines of survival. The small, strange customs people developed just to make it through those frozen months. Things like sleeping with animals, drinking specific brews for warmth, or even trying to predict how bad the next winter would be by staring at candles. Because yes, that was a thing. But we'll float into those chilly little habits in the next part. The rituals of warmth, as strange and creative as the age itself.